Break the hinges. The safe belongs to the HOA now. That was what Marjorie Voss said as three men smashed through my front door at 6:12 in the morning. One of them shoved me against the wall, while the other two dragged a 600-pound safe across the oak floor my father had installed by hand. Marjorie held up what looked like a court order and smiled. By Friday, this house will belong to us too. I didn't fight them. I didn't call the sheriff. I watched them load my safe into an unmarked truck and drive away. Because Marjorie had no idea who I was, and she had no idea the safe was still listening. 3 months earlier, I had returned to the house where I grew up. My father, William Holloway, had built most of it himself in 1978. He framed the garage, laid the oak floors, and planted the maple trees along the driveway. After he died, I kept the property but rarely stayed there. My job demanded long hours, confidential travel, and a life that was easier to manage from an apartment near the state capitol. Then my wife, Rebecca, died after a long battle with cancer. The apartment became unbearable. Every room reminded me of hospital calls, medication schedules, and the silence that followed her final breath. So I returned to my father's house looking for something simple, a quiet place where no one needed anything from me. I drove an 11-year-old pickup. I wore work boots. I repaired the porch myself. To most people in Silver Pines, I looked like a tired, middle-aged widower fixing an old house on a limited budget. That was exactly what I wanted them to see. The first HOA violation arrived 4 days after I moved in. My garage door was the wrong shade of brown. The second said my pickup could not remain in the driveway overnight. The third claimed my security cameras violated community privacy standards. All 3 notices were signed by Marjorie Voss, president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. There was only one problem. My house was not part of Silver Pines. The development had been built years after my father bought the land. According to the original county plat, my property sat outside the HOA boundary by 87 feet. I mailed Marjorie a copy of the deed and the current county map. Her response arrived the next morning. Historical documents do not override the board's authority to protect community standards. That sentence told me this was not a clerical mistake. Marjorie knew she had no legal authority over my property. She simply believed no one would stop her. A week later, I found an elderly woman standing beside my mailbox. Her name was Elena Ruiz. Before she spoke, she glanced toward the white Lexus parked outside Marjorie's house. "You need to stop arguing with them," she whispered. "They'll take your house." I asked what she meant. Elena told me about her younger brother, Miguel. Miguel had owned a small home near the community lake for 19 years. After his wife died, he fell behind on basic maintenance. The HOA started issuing violations. First, peeling paint. Then an overgrown hedge. Then an emergency safety assessment for a drainage problem that did not exist. Within 8 months, $900 in fines had grown to more than $28,000 after legal fees, collection charges, and special assessments. The HOA placed a lien on his home. Miguel tried to challenge it, but Sheriff Darius Boone repeatedly appeared at his door and warned him that resisting the board could lead to arrest. Eventually, Miguel sold for almost 40% below market value. The buyer was a company called Evergreen Community Holdings. Elena handed me a folder containing copies of his notices and closing documents. At the bottom of the sale agreement was the name of Evergreen's registered agent, Nolan Price, the HOA's attorney. That evening, I searched the state corporate database. Evergreen Community Holdings owned 7 homes inside Silver Pines. Every property had followed the same pattern. Escalating violations, an HOA lien, a frightened homeowner, a sale far below market value, then a transfer to a company linked to someone connected with the board. 7 homes were not a coincidence. and Marjorie's signature appeared somewhere in every file. I began speaking with former residents. Quietly, I asked for violation notices, payment records, and correspondence with the HOA. Within 2 weeks, Marjorie changed her strategy. 2 men wearing Silver Pines maintenance shirts entered my driveway and photographed the inside of my garage. The next day, a red notice appeared on my door declaring my property an immediate community hazard. Then Marjorie demanded the access code to my security system. She claimed the HOA needed it for emergency inspections. I refused in writing. That Friday, Sheriff Boone arrived at my house. He was a broad man with silver hair, a polished uniform, and the relaxed confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned. He walked past my private property sign without asking permission. "You're making powerful people uncomfortable," he said. I asked the HOA to stop issuing violations against property it doesn't control. He smiled as if I had told a joke. Property boundaries can be interpreted. Recorded deeds usually can't. His smile disappeared. Boone stepped closer. People who fight this board usually end up moving. Some lose more than their houses. His body camera was not recording. The gold watch on his wrist looked more expensive than his official salary could easily explain. After he left, I locked the door and called Deputy Attorney General Helen Ward. Helen and I had worked together for 11 years. I told her what I had found. 7 suspicious property transfers, an HOA attorney connected to the buyers, a sheriff threatening residents, and a board president claiming authority over land that had never belonged to her association. Helen was silent for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Are you calling as a homeowner, Grant, or as director of the state anti-corruption unit?" I looked at the red notice on my door. "Both. My name is Grant Holloway. For 22 years, I investigated bribery, extortion, procurement fraud, and public corruption. For the previous 4 years, I had led the state anti-corruption unit. Marjorie did not know that. My position was deliberately absent from most public directories because many of our investigations involved officials with access to government databases. Helen authorized a preliminary investigation, but 7 suspicious sales and 1 verbal threat were not enough to dismantle an organized operation. We needed proof of coordination. We needed financial records. And we needed evidence showing exactly how the homeowners were selected, pressured, and stripped of their property. Arresting Boone for threatening me might have felt satisfying. It also would have warned everyone else. Marjorie would destroy records. Nolan would dissolve the shell companies. Loretta Crane, the HOA treasurer, would move the money. So I continued playing the role they had assigned me, the lonely homeowner, the tired widower, the man with an old truck and no political connections. Then Marjorie made a mistake. She sent me a certified letter accusing me of possessing confidential financial records belonging to the association. I had never told anyone I possessed financial records. She had just revealed what frightened her most. I called Helen again. We give them something they believe they have to steal. The safe had belonged to my father. It was old, solid, and heavy enough to require 4 men and a reinforced dolly. Under judicial authorization, our technical team modified it. 2 pinhole cameras were hidden behind the decorative trim. 3 microphones were embedded inside the door. A GPS unit was placed beneath the steel lining. A separate transmitter sent encrypted audio and video to a surveillance vehicle. We filled the safe with folders labeled Property Transfer Records, HOA Financial Accounts, Sheriff Communications. There was nothing sensitive inside, only blank pages, sample ledgers, and documents designed to look important from across a room. Then I made sure Marjorie saw me use it. One afternoon, I carried a thick file from my truck into the garage while her white Lexus sat across the street. I paused before placing the file inside the safe. Her phone appeared above the steering wheel. She took a photograph. 2 days later, Nolan Price sent me an emergency community property seizure order. It had no valid court number, no legitimate seal, no judge's authorization. It was a legal-looking piece of fiction written to frighten someone who did not understand the law. The document demanded immediate surrender of the safe. I refused. At 6:12 the next morning, Marjorie arrived with 3 men, and they smashed through my front door. From a surveillance van 2 streets away, our team watched the GPS signal begin to move. The truck carrying the safe passed the HOA office. It passed Nolan Price's law firm. Then it left the main road and entered an industrial district near the old rail yard. The signal stopped inside a warehouse registered to another shell company. Our cameras activated when the safe door opened. Marjorie appeared first. Nolan stood beside her, wearing gloves. Loretta Crane entered carrying a laptop. Then Sheriff Boone walked into view. That was the moment the investigation changed. Boone was not simply protecting the operation. He was part of it. Nolan opened the first folder and cursed when he found blank paper. Marjorie turned toward Boone. "He knows," she said. "Holloway knows about the houses." Loretta asked whether they should move the accounts. Nolan shook his head. "Not until we control his property. If we transfer everything now, the banks may flag it." Boone asked how quickly the HOA could place a lien on my house. Marjorie answered immediately. "Friday. We hold an emergency meeting, declare him a threat, and approve the assessment. Once the lien is recorded, Evergreen buys the debt." Then Loretta asked a question that made everyone inside the surveillance van go silent. "What about the other 38? 38 houses, not 7. Marjorie opened a metal cabinet and removed a handwritten ledger. "We finish Holloway first," she said. "Once his house is ours, the rest of them will stop asking questions." Boone laughed. "They always stop when the patrol car shows up. The safe had given us their voices. But the ledger in Marjorie's hand could help 38 families prove what had been done to them, and we still did not know where she planned to hide it. We could have arrested them at the warehouse. Instead, we watched. The microphones continued recording, while Nolan discussed shell companies. Loretta described payments, and Boone admitted using false police reports to intimidate homeowners. More than $9 million had moved through their network. Still, Helen made the difficult decision to delay the arrests. We needed the physical ledger. We needed the banking records. And we needed proof that the liens, board votes, and property purchases were all part of one coordinated scheme. That meant I had to remain silent. Marjorie told the community that I had stolen HOA records. Boone filed a report describing me as unstable and potentially dangerous. The board increased my alleged debt to $46,000. My photograph appeared in the neighborhood newsletter beneath the words, "Public Safety Warning." People who once waved to me stopped making eye contact. A family across the street told their children not to walk near my driveway. Someone painted the word "thief" across my garage door. Before sunrise, I stood outside and scrubbed it away alone. For the first time since the investigation began, I wondered whether I had underestimated the cost. Then Elena arrived carrying an old composition notebook. "My brother wrote everything down," she said. Miguel's notebook contained dates, names, and amounts. Every visit from Marjorie, every threat from Boone, every payment demanded by Nolan. On the final page, Miguel had written an account number beside the name Evergreen Community Holdings. Our financial team traced it. The same account had received money connected to every suspicious property sale. From there, funds moved into companies controlled by Marjorie, Nolan, and Loretta. One payment helped purchase Boone's vacation cabin. Another paid for Marjorie's Lexus. Miguel's notebook connected the victims, the property transfers, and the money. Over the next 2 days, I met other families. A disabled veteran had been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp without architectural approval. A widow lost her house after the HOA claimed it mailed notices to an address where she had never lived. An elderly couple sold after Boone warned that their grandson could be arrested for trespassing when he came to help them. Those people had spent years believing they had failed. They had not failed. They had been selected. Marjorie targeted people who were isolated, grieving, elderly, or unlikely to afford a prolonged legal fight. Then she used words like community standards and property values to disguise organized theft. Friday morning, she announced an emergency public meeting. The stated purpose was to protect Silver Pines from me. The real purpose was to seize my house. This time, we were ready to let her try. The community center was full when I arrived. Behind the board table hung a large banner, Silver Pines HOA, protecting our community since 2016. Marjorie sat in the center. Nolan had stacked legal folders in front of him. Loretta controlled the projector. Boone stood beside the exit in full uniform, one hand resting near his holster. An HOA volunteer recorded the meeting for the community website. Marjorie waited until I reached the center aisle. "Mr. Holloway, you are present only because this board believes in transparency." Several residents turned to look at me. She displayed photographs of my safe, my cameras, and the red notice on my door. Then she accused me of stealing financial records, threatening board members, and obstructing a lawful investigation. Every allegation was false, but she delivered each one with complete confidence. Nolan presented the fake seizure order as if it had come from a real court. Loretta displayed an alleged balance of $46,312. Marjorie called for an emergency vote authorizing the HOA to take control of my property. Every board member raised a hand. Then she smiled at me. "You came here believing one old deed would protect you." I placed my black case on the table. "It does." She laughed. "Sheriff Boone, remove him." Boone stepped forward. I did not move. I opened the case. The first thing I removed was the original county deed. I placed it beneath the document camera. The property description appeared on the screen behind Marjorie. My parcel sat outside the Silver Pines boundary. There was no HOA covenant, no annexation agreement, no vote authorizing the association to control my land. Marjorie barely looked at it. "That map is outdated. The county certified it yesterday." Nolan leaned toward his microphone. "This board has de facto authority through community integration. There is no such property doctrine," I said. His face tightened. The second item I placed on the table was their seizure order. I identified the invalid case number, the copied seal, and the signature that had never been authorized by a judge. The document was not an order. It was evidence. A low murmur spread through the room. Nolan slowly closed the folder in front of him. Marjorie raised her voice. "This man is manipulating you. He is not an attorney. He has no authority here." That brings me to the third item. I removed my badge and placed my state credentials beside it. "My name is Grant Holloway. I am the director of the State Anti-Corruption Unit." No one applauded. The room simply went silent. Marjorie stared at the badge. Boone stopped walking toward me. Nolan whispered something to Loretta. I turned toward the projector. For the past 3 weeks, my unit has been investigating the fraudulent transfer of homes inside this community. Marjorie finally found her voice. "This is absurd." I pressed a button. Video from inside the stolen safe filled the wall. Marjorie appeared in the warehouse. Her recorded voice echoed through the community center. "Once his house is ours, the rest of them will stop asking questions." Then Boone's voice followed. "They always stop when the patrol car shows up." Every face in the room turned toward him. Boone moved for the exit. Two state investigators stepped through the doorway. He stopped. The recording continued. Nolan discussed fraudulent liens. Loretta described moving money through shell companies. Marjorie listed the types of residents they preferred to target: elderly, widowed, isolated, and financially vulnerable. Elena sat in the front row with Miguel's notebook pressed against her chest. When her brother's name appeared on the screen, she began to cry. Marjorie stood and pointed at the video. "This is fabricated. He illegally recorded private communications." I displayed the GPS history, judicial authorization, and time-stamped footage of her men removing the safe from my house. "You stole the recording equipment yourself," I said. For the first time since I met her, Marjorie had nothing to say. Then the doors behind the board opened. More investigators entered. Marjorie looked toward Boone. Boone looked toward Nolan. Nolan looked down at the fake order he had written. They had spent years making their victims feel alone. Now they were surrounded by every person they had lied to. The lead investigator approached Boone first. "Sheriff, remove your weapon and place it on the table." Boone hesitated. Then he saw the agents behind him and slowly unfastened his holster. His badge followed. Nolan was arrested for forgery, conspiracy, extortion, and money laundering. Loretta was taken into custody for financial fraud and racketeering. Investigators recovered the handwritten ledger from a locked cabinet inside the warehouse. Marjorie was arrested last. As the cuffs closed around her wrists, she stood directly beneath the banner that said, "Protecting Our Community." She demanded that the board call its attorney. No one reminded her that the attorney was already in handcuffs. Search teams entered the HOA office, Nolan's law firm and Boone's county workspace that evening. They recovered false inspection reports, forged signatures, altered mailing records, and spreadsheets ranking homeowners by age, income, and likelihood of resisting. 38 properties had been targeted. Some had already been sold. Others were days away from foreclosure. The operation had lasted nearly 7 years. It ended because the people running it believed a quiet man in work boots would be too frightened to challenge them. The criminal cases took months. Marjorie eventually received a lengthy prison sentence. Nolan lost his law license. Boone was removed from office and convicted of bribery, obstruction, and abuse of authority. Loretta cooperated with investigators and helped recover several $1 million. But the most important results did not happen inside a courtroom. Every fraudulent lien was suspended. Homes that had not yet been resold were returned to their owners. Families whose properties could not be restored received restitution from seized assets and insurance settlements. Miguel's case was formally reopened. Elena received a written declaration confirming that her brother had been the victim of a coordinated fraud scheme, not a man who had failed to pay legitimate debts. Silver Pines elected a new board. Financial records became accessible to every homeowner. No emergency lien could be approved without independent legal review. No board member, attorney, or vendor could purchase a property involved in an HOA collection action. The community center converted an unused office into a free property record clinic. Once a month, volunteers helped residents examine deeds, liens, and notices before signing anything. They asked me to become the new HOA president. I declined. I had never belonged to the HOA, and after everything that happened, I still preferred my quiet house, my old truck, and the maple trees my father had planted. Marjorie believed power came from a title, a clipboard, and a sheriff willing to frighten people into silence. She was wrong. Titles can be abused, documents can be forged, and fear can keep good people quiet for years. But real authority leaves a record. Real ownership has a deed. And sooner or later, every person who builds an empire on intimidation makes the same mistake. They assume the quiet man is doing nothing. They never realize he is documenting everything.